Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is not just a story, it's an invitation to step into a world that once existed. A world colder, darker, and far more merciless than we often imagine. The video you're about to watch asks a haunting question: why you wouldn't survive a Victorian winter in London. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. Now, let's walk together into the shadows of 19th century London, where survival was never promised, and the very air itself became your first enemy. It begins not with the clang of church bells, nor the rattle of carriage wheels, but with a silence so dense it feels alive. Step into London as the winter of the 19th century tightens its grip, and the first thing you will notice is not the cold itself, but the breath of the city, a fog thick enough to drown you. The Victorians called it London particular, as if it were a delicacy served to them by nature, but in truth it was poison, an atmosphere brewed from coal dust, damp air, and smoke that had no patience for lungs already bruised by poverty. You would take that first breath believing you could withstand it, believing your chest strong enough, yet already your throat would tighten. A sour sting, like acid burning at the back of the mouth, creeps down to the lungs, leaving you with a cough that feels older than yourself. The fog is not gentle mist. It is thick, choking, greenish yellow, clinging to the lamplight and swallowing whole streets until the world becomes a blur of shadows. Step too far, and you will not see your own hand before your face. This is how the city welcomes you in winter, by making the air itself a threat. And yet, Londoners breathe it still. For what choice do they have? Coal fires burn in every home, in every factory, in every damp cellar where a child curls for warmth. Each chimney sends up its offering of smoke, and the fog gathers these gifts greedily until the entire city sinks into a soup of soot and frost. To live here is to be steeped in it, pores clogged, skin yellowed, lungs turned brittle before their time. You may imagine that you could endure by staying indoors, but the truth is that walls are no defense. The fog seeps through cracks in wooden shutters, slips beneath doors, and winds its way into blankets. Candles tremble within it. It dulls vision, dims firelight, makes the inside of your room feel like a cave. And when you wake in the morning, you find a black residue clinging to your bedding, your clothing, even to your very lips. Each inhale draws more of London into you. It is not merely uncomfortable, it is fatal. Infants suffocate in their cribs before their mothers realize that the damp has silenced them. The elderly collapse in alleys with lungs choked black. And for the working poor who labor outside, there is no refuge at all. They must walk blindly through it, groping their way down cobblestone lanes, past the faint orange glow of gas lamps barely visible through the haze. More than once, a person has stumbled too near the edge of the riverbank, the fog hiding the water until it is too late. Some vanish that way. Others fall beneath carriage wheels whose drivers cannot see more than a yard ahead. Death here does not announce itself. It waits patiently in the air, in the breath you thoughtlessly draw. The fog is not only an enemy of the body, it is an enemy of the mind. Imagine walking through it, hour after hour, your world reduced to a blur of shifting shadows. Shapes emerge suddenly and vanish again, some human, others perhaps not. Men with knives slip into it like ghosts, committing murder unseen. A scream rises and falls, muffled by the thickness, and you do not know whether it comes from yards away or from the figure standing just beside you. The city becomes a stage for hallucinations. Many swore they saw spirits in the haze, pale figures wandering between the gaslights. Others claimed the fog itself whispered, that it pressed against their skulls until madness became the only defense. Yet this was not a passing affliction. It lasted for days. sometimes weeks, hanging heavy over London like a lid upon a cauldron. Businesses faltered, ships delayed their journeys along the Thames, and pedestrians carried torches just to move through the streets. Crime thrived in it. Children disappeared in the yellow-grey folds, swallowed whole by the city's breath. For some, the fog was a cloak that allowed them to act unseen. For others, it was a shroud they never returned from. Do not think the wealthy immune. Even in the grand homes of Kensington and Bloomsbury, coal fires burned endlessly, and the fog answered them all the same. Ladies of society found their gowns stained with soot, their gloves marked black from nothing more than touching a windowsill. Physicians treated them for a winter cough that never seemed to leave, a polite term for the slow strangulation of the lungs. And though they had the money to purchase thicker curtains, better coal, warmer beds, the breath of the city still pressed against them. It did not care for wealth, only for lungs. But for the poor, it was worse, always worse. In the rookeries of East London, where entire families crowded into single rooms, the fog combined with damp walls and leaky roofs until disease found a permanent home. Tuberculosis thrived here. Pneumonia fed freely. To be poor in London was already to live with death as a neighbour, but in winter, with the fog as an accomplice, that neighbour moved in entirely. Every cough was a warning bell, every shallow breath a reminder that survival was not promised. It is easy to think of fog as something transient, an inconvenience, a passing shroud, but in Victorian London it was a season in itself. The newspapers wrote of great smogs, as if they were annual festivals, and each winter, as the first tendrils rolled in across the Thames, Londoners knew what it meant. Weeks of darkness, of sickness, of stumbling blindly through a city that wished to consume them. For you, arriving fresh in this place, there would be no adjustment. Your body is not hardened to the soot, your lungs not yet scarred to withstand the acrid burn. You would take a single day's worth of breaths, and already your chest would ache. You would wake the next morning with a throat raw, as if lined with sand. And soon, very soon, the cough would begin. It would not leave you. It would dig itself deeper until you learned, as every Londoner must, that the city lives inside you now. This is why the first breath of the London fog is also the first step toward your undoing. It is an initiation, a silent oath you never agreed to. To survive here is not simply to withstand the cold, but to breathe poison daily, to let your body be reshaped by it. And you are not ready. Few ever were. The streets in winter are not merely damp with frost. They are paved with the residue of every chimney, every factory, every human breath mixing into one. Horses stumble on the slick cobbles, leaving behind steaming piles that the fog clings to and magnifies. The smell alone is enough to turn the stomach. It is not clean air you inhale. It is the very waste of a city crammed with millions. You breathe excrement, smoke, dust, and death, all dissolved into the same invisible soup. And though Londoners walk on, shrouded and blind, you would falter. Your eyes water constantly, stinging with the grit that seeps into every blink. Your clothes reek after an hour. Your skin feels unwashed, no matter how you scrub. Every sensation tells you the same truth. You do not belong here. The city rejects you, even as it consumes you. There are those who grow accustomed, who accept the cough as natural, who no longer flinch when the fog hides their neighbour's door. They survive, or at least they continue. But you, new to this winter, untrained in its cruelty, you would not. The first breath is already your undoing. You may not realize it yet, but the fog has settled into you, and it does not leave. It is said that winter reveals the character of a city. In London, winter reveals its hunger, and the fog is the first mouthful it takes of you. The fog does not linger alone. It brings with it a silence that clings to the bones of the city, a stillness broken not by birdsong or laughter, but by the low groan of empty stomachs. Step past the streets where smoke coils around the gas lamps, and you will begin to notice something quieter than the choking coughs, the sound of hunger. The first signs come in the windows. Peer through the frost-blurred glass of a tenement in Whitechapel, and you will see a family huddled together, not around a table, but around the absence of one. A crust of bread, hard as brick, sits untouched in the middle, to be divided carefully, too carefully, so that the taste of it may last. It is not nourishment, it is ritual, a gesture towards survival when survival itself is uncertain. In wealthier quarters, tables groan with roasted meats and steaming puddings, the air inside heavy with the scent of spice and fat. Carriages deliver pheasants and haunches of venison to those who can afford them. But for most of London, food is a dream carried on the aroma of kitchens they will never enter. Hunger presses its face to the glass of the city, leaving behind trails of frost where hands have lingered too long against cold panes. Bread, when it can be found, is often stale, adulterated with chalk or alum to stretch the flour further. Milk is watered down, cheese flecked with mould, meat crawling with maggots. The poor know this, but they buy it all the same, for there is no other choice. A slice of bad bread is better than none at all. A stew made of bones, boiled until their marrow leaches into cloudy water, becomes a feast. The vendors in the markets call out their wares, apples gone soft with rot, scraps swept from butcher floors, eels pulled slimy from the river. It is not sustenance, it is delay. Delay of weakness, of fainting, of death. To stand in the market is to understand desperation. A mother barters for a handful of carrots, her eyes hollow, her infant clutching at her shawl with skeletal fingers. A boy no older than 10 fights with a stray dog over a discarded potato. The cries of traders echo through the fog. Hot chestnuts, warm pies. But the pies are little more than air wrapped in pastry, filled with sawdust or offal unfit for the wealthy's scraps. And the chestnuts are counted out singly, each one a treasure that will vanish too quickly in the mouth. Hunger is not a companion of the poor alone. It stalks the city broadly, though it wears different masks. In drawing rooms lined with velvet, the wealthy complain of shortages, of the difficulty in acquiring fresh game, of the cost of sugar that rises with each passing year. Their complaints are not hunger, but inconvenience. Yet even in their voices, there is a shadow of unease. For the city knows no boundary between classes when it wishes to remind them who rules. But it is in the rookeries, the crowded slums, that hunger shows its full cruelty. The rooms are damp and narrow, packed with bodies who share more than air. They share starvation. A single loaf, carried home by a child, becomes the center of a battle between siblings. Mothers lie awake at night listening to their children's stomachs growl louder than the rats that skitter along the walls. Fathers return from hours of searching for work with empty hands, and the silence that follows is heavier than any fog. In these winters, theft becomes necessity. Boys dart through streets, snatching bread from vendors and vanishing into alleys. Men steal coal from carts, not for warmth, but for the chance to trade it for food. Women, with no other means left, trade their bodies for a few pennies. Enough perhaps to buy a heel of bread or a handful of oats. Hunger makes no allowances for dignity, and the city notices. The workhouses fill, their gates opening to the desperate. Inside, gruel is ladled out, thin, tasteless, more water than substance. Yet even this watery broth becomes a prize, swallowed quickly despite the nausea it brings. Inmates of the workhouse stare at the bowls as though hypnotized, waiting for the moment when they can taste at least a semblance of sustenance. Children scrape their spoons along the wood, chasing every drop as though it could silence the gnawing in their bellies. But not all can gain entry. The workhouses demand more than desperation. They demand submission, the breaking of families, the surrender of freedom. Many choose the streets instead, where hunger is sharper but pride remains intact. There, in the alleys and beneath the bridges, you find the true victims of a Victorian winter, Faces pressed against frost, eyes dulled, lips cracked, bodies curled upon themselves as though to shrink into nothing. What hunger does not consume outright, it weakens. Illness follows in its wake. A body starved is a body defenseless. Pneumonia, typhus, cholera. These are not separate evils, but companions of hunger. They settle into weakened frames, thrive in the gaps left by nourishment never taken. A cough that might have been endured becomes fatal when the chest is hollow. A fever burns hotter when there is no fat to shield the body, and thus hunger does not simply gnaw at the belly, it opens the door for death itself. The winter market by the Thames tells this story plainly. Fishmongers' stalls sag with unsold wares, their fish spoiling in the damp air, eyes glazed white, flesh already turning. Yet even these are bought. Mothers scrape scales from half-rotten mackerel, boil them down into soups that smell more of sickness than of food. And still, families eat them, because hunger does not care for flavour. It does not care for rot. It cares only for silence, for the temporary stillness of the stomach's cry. Behind frosted windows, this is the daily theatre. Families gather not to share meals, but to share absence. The father carves the loaf into slices so thin they seem translucent. A child licks the knife, not for mischief, but to taste the ghost of flour upon its edge. Candles burn low, and the shadows seem to mock the table where dishes remain empty. Outside, the city continues to breathe its choking fog, but within, the air is filled with the heavier weight of want. And yet, perhaps the cruelest part of this hunger is the nearness of abundance. The poor live within sight and smell of plenty. The great markets of Covent Garden and Smithfield overflow with meats and fruits, their displays dazzling under the weak winter sun. But these are guarded by price, a barrier as impenetrable as iron bars. To walk past is to endure torture, to smell roasted meats while your own belly twists in pain. Children press their faces to the glass of bakeries, watching steam rise from golden crusts they will never taste. Hunger is not distant, it is sharpened by contrast. This city does not starve evenly, it starves selectively, deliberately, and in this lies its cruelty, the reminder that while some dine in warmth, others wither in cold. Hunger is not simply lack, it is spectacle. It is the vision of food you cannot have, the sound of feasting you cannot join, the smell of roasting meat carried cruelly by the fog into alleys where bodies tremble in the frost. By the time the frost deepens, faces grow hollow. Children look like miniature elders, cheeks sunken, eyes too large for their skulls. Their limbs are thin sticks wrapped in rags. Their breath rattles with weakness. And in the silence of the night, when the fires burn low, the city listens to the quietest sound of all, the sighs of those too tired to hunger any longer. Hunger does not always kill with violence. Often it kills with stillness. And so, as the windows glaze with frost and the fog presses its heavy breath against the panes, London reveals its second truth. If the air does not suffocate you, hunger will. You would not survive a Victorian winter here, because even as you cough and stumble through the streets, your body would betray you from within. The city demands more than breath. It demands a belly filled with food that you cannot afford, that you cannot reach. The frost creeps across the glass. The city waits outside. And inside, behind those frozen windows, hunger sharpens its knife. When the fog thickened and the windows frosted over, the streets did not fall silent. They pulsed with a life of their own, restless, relentless, incapable of slumber. To believe that London slept in winter was to misunderstand the very marrow of the city. It throbbed long past midnight, its veins lit by flickering gas lamps and its heart beating in the alleys where the destitute and the desperate gathered. Night did not soften London, it sharpened it. Hunger, soot, and cold turned the streets into a gauntlet. By day, misery could be half hidden behind commerce, behind the noise of carts and the bustle of markets. But at night, stripped of disguise, the city showed its bare face. And it was a face that smiled with broken teeth. Carriages rolled still, wheels clattering on cobblestones slick with frost, drivers squinting through yellow haze, their lamps carved narrow tunnels of light in the smothering dark. Passengers inside drew their coats closer, careful not to let their eyes linger too long on the figures pressed into doorways or crouched beneath archways. The wealthy might move quickly from ballrooms to townhouses, but the poor remained tethered to the streets. They had no rooms to retreat to, no beds but stone steps, no blanket but their own thin rags. Every shadow seemed occupied, some by men with knives glinting faintly under the gaslight, waiting for the soft sound of boots that did not belong. Others by women whose faces were painted not with rouge, but with desperation, offering warmth of the cheapest and coldest kind. Children huddled in clusters, wide-eyed, too tired to cry, too hungry to sleep, staring at the endless procession of boots and hooves. The streets were not quiet. They hummed with voices, the groans of drunks sprawled in gutters, the calls of vendors still peddling roasted chestnuts and pies made of mystery, the songs of sailors staggering from riverside taverns, the muttered bargains of thieves trading stolen goods under archways. A constant chorus, broken now and then by a scream that rose high, then vanished quickly into the fog. The police patrolled, but their presence was a thin line against the tide. A whistle might pierce the air, followed by hurried boots, yet crime spread faster than order. The alleys were too many, the shadows too deep. A body could be robbed in the time it took for a lamplighter to move from one post to the next. By morning, it might lie stiff in the frost, unnoticed until the fog cleared enough to reveal it. The city's restless nights carried dangers greater than theft. Disease moved freely here, carried by breath, by touch, by the close quarters of sleeping bodies pressed together for warmth. Smallpox scars glimmered pale under lamplight. Tuberculosis rattled in the throats of children. Typhus lurked in lice crawling beneath ragged collars. To walk the streets after dark was to walk through a living catalogue of illness, each cough and sneeze a potential death sentence. And still, people walked, because to stay still was worse. The cold seeped quickly into idle limbs, stiffening them until movement became impossible. Men wandered without purpose, simply to keep blood flowing. Women prowled for customers. Orphans ran errands for strangers, carrying packages they dared not question. The streets required motion, ceaseless and merciless. They punished anyone who slowed. The Thames itself seemed to conspire in this sleeplessness. Along its banks, barges groaned and shifted, ferrymen shouted, water slapped against the piers. The river never rested, carrying with it the waste of the city, the corpses of animals, sometimes of people, and the stink of decay. Its dark waters reflected the weak glow of lamps, as though mocking the attempt to light a city that refused to be tamed. By night, the hunger that gnawed behind windows during the day spilled into the open. Men fought in the alleys over scraps of food, over coins no larger than buttons. Knives flashed briefly, then vanished into the fog. The police might find bloodstains later, but rarely the bodies. The city swallowed its dead as readily as it swallowed its poor. Not even the sound of church bells marked the passing hours. The fog swallowed their tolls, muffling them until they seemed distant and unreal. Time lost its edges. Midnight bled into dawn without distinction, the gas lamps burning through both. To walk these streets was to lose sense of day and night alike. The only measure was survival. Another breath, another step, another hour stolen from the cold. Children became creatures of these streets, darting like shadows. They learned to sleep curled in doorways, to beg in voices rehearsed until they became second nature. They sold newspapers, matches, anything that could be carried in small hands. And when nothing else remained, they sold themselves. Many never reached adulthood. The streets claimed them before hunger or disease could finish its work. But even for those who lived in houses, the streets were inescapable. Night workers, night soil men hauling waste, costermongers wheeling carts, dockers unloading ships, laboured under frostbitten skies. Their bodies grew numb, their hands raw, their lungs battered by the air. They worked because not working meant hunger, and hunger was always waiting, whispering from behind frosted windows. The fog blurred more than vision. It blurred morality. Crimes committed at night often vanished by morning. A robbery left no witnesses when no one could see. A disappearance raised no questions when so many people slipped into the fog daily. It was said the city itself preferred the dark, that it thrived in it, breeding secrets and sins as naturally as rats bred in cellars. And still the lamps burned. Their orange glow trembled through the fog, marking islands of visibility in an ocean of shadow. Lamplighters made their rounds with poles in hand, lighting flames that barely pierced the air. Without them, the city would have been swallowed entirely. But their flames were fragile, easily extinguished by gusts of wind or hands that preferred darkness to light. It was not only crime that haunted the streets. The cold itself was a predator. Men sat down on steps to rest, closed their eyes, and did not open them again. The frost crept over them, turning their stillness into statues. In the morning, children prodded their stiffened forms, curious rather than frightened. Death was a companion too common to fear. The sleeplessness of the streets was not vitality, it was desperation. Each sound, each shadow, each flicker of lamplight testified to a city that could not rest because rest meant surrender. And yet, for those who walked them unprepared, the punishment was swift. A stranger wandering into these restless nights, unarmed and unguarded, would not last. Hunger would draw eyes toward their pockets. Frost would stiffen their limbs. Fog would steal their bearings. And the city itself would decide their fate. By dawn, when the gas lamps dimmed and the first pale light bled through the haze, the streets bore their scars openly. Bloodstains frozen onto cobblestones, broken bottles glittering like teeth, women slumped in corners, eyes half closed, waiting for the next coin. Children curled together in heaps, breath misting in the cold. London did not sleep, but it allowed its exhaustion to show briefly before the cycle began again. And always, the fog remained, as if amused by the endless struggle. The city breathed, the streets stirred, and the sleepless rhythm of London's winter continued, merciless, unyielding, hungry for more. London's nights bled into mornings without distinction, yet the waking hours carried their own cruelty. With the first faint light, the city revealed what had hidden in the dark, chimneys stretching in every direction like blackened spires, each one coughing smoke into the already heavy sky. If the streets never slept, the chimneys never paused. They were the lungs of industry, and they exhaled poison with every breath. Coal was the marrow of the city. It fed the factories, the railways, the workshops. It warmed parlours and workhouses alike. To live in London was to burn coal, and to burn coal was to inhale its ghost. The air did not drift free. It clung, oily and acrid, smearing itself onto skin, staining collars, seeping into hair. Children ran their fingers along windowsills and came away with soot-blackened tips. Mothers scrubbed daily, but the grime returned before the water had cooled. For the poor, coal was never abundant enough to be warmth. It was rationed, bought by the shovel, carried home in sacks that left trails of black dust across the snow. A family might huddle close around a fire no larger than a candle's flame, the coal burning too quickly, the smoke billowing more than the heat it gave. The choice was cruel: breathe thick smoke inside the room, or leave the window ajar and let the freezing fog pour in. Both options suffocated, only in different languages. The wealthier classes did not escape its touch. Their chimneys burned hotter, longer, feeding on higher quality coal, but they too breathed the consequence. Drawing rooms glittered with chandeliers while the air inside turned sour with invisible filth. Servants coughed as they stoked the fires, wiping sweat and soot from their brows, carrying the stain of coal into every corner of the house. No wall was safe from it. No curtain escaped its film. The city itself was painted in shades of grey and black. Step outside, and the world seemed drowned in shadow. Even at midday, the sky carried the colour of old bruises. Yellow, grey, green. An unnatural palette smeared across the heavens. Sunlight struggled to break through, reduced to a dull glow that cast no true warmth. Daylight was not light, but a dim suggestion of it, filtered through a ceiling of smoke. The coal smoke mingled with fog until the air became a living thing, thick enough to grasp. It pressed against the throat, filled the mouth with grit, lined the teeth with dust. A single breath scraped its way down, leaving behind a cough that rattled deep in the chest. Children wheezed as though aged, their ribs visible beneath threadbare shirts, their eyes watering from the sting. For the elderly, each breath was a gamble. Inhale and risk collapse, or hold it in and invite suffocation. Doctors gave the affliction names: winter bronchitis, catarrh, consumption, but these were only polite disguises for the truth. The air was killing them. The newspapers printed death tallies without surprise, listing numbers as if they were no more than the price of grain. It was understood. Winter brought not only cold, but also a harvest of lungs. Inside the factories, the choking grew worse. Workers inhaled dust along with the smoke, iron filings and cotton fluff mixing with coal soot until the air became a storm of particulates. Men bent over their tasks until their spines curled, coughing into rags that turned black by day's end. Women fainted at their looms, not from weakness but from lack of oxygen. Children, small enough to crawl under machinery, filled their lungs with filth before their bones were even fully grown. By the time they reached adulthood, if they reached it, their bodies bore the signature of the city's air. The coal fires did not stop at harming lungs. They blackened snow into slush before it could settle, turned riverside frost into greasy ice. The Thames itself seemed to choke, its surface reflecting not the sky, but the endless plume of chimneys. Even water became tainted. Rain fell with soot, staining clothes, scarring stone. Londoners called it black snow, as if the city had rewritten the very language of weather. And yet, there was no choice but to breathe it. Coal was survival. Without it, the fires would die, the rooms would freeze, the factories would halt, the wages would vanish. To reject coal was to reject life itself. So Londoners lived in contradiction. They cursed the smoke as they shoveled it. They coughed as they warmed themselves by it. They wiped it from their children's faces, even as they fed it to their fires. Strangers who arrived in winter often underestimated it. They believed the darkness to be no more than weather, the cough no more than chill. But days stretched into weeks, and the lungs adjusted poorly. Visitors found themselves spitting into handkerchiefs only to find streaks of black. Their voices grew hoarse, their chests tight. Some never left, carried instead to graveyards where the earth itself seemed coated in soot. The city claimed them without malice. London never hated its victims. It simply absorbed them. The smell was everywhere, a sour, metallic tang that clung to nostrils long after one left the street. It mixed with horse dung, with the rot of markets, with the damp of the river, until the very act of breathing became a burden. There was no clean corner, no untouched pocket of air. Even in the countryside beyond, the wind carried London's breath, dusting fields and farms with the residue of its endless fires. At night, the smoke thickened further, pressed low by the weight of the sky. Gas lamps flickered weakly against it, their glow dulled to faint halos. People stumbled through streets as if underwater, coughing into scarves, eyes watering, lungs burning. Voices dropped, not out of quiet, but because shouting only tore at throats already raw. Coal smoke shaped the very rhythms of life. Chimneys demanded constant feeding. Scuttling children carried buckets of black stone up staircases slick with soot. Housewives rationed fires carefully, letting flames die during the day so there might be enough coal left for night. Men with little to spare sold broken bits of timber or animal dung as substitutes, filling the air with fouler fumes still. The city smelled of survival, and survival smelled like ash. This was not accident. It was identity. London was a city built on coal, and coal wrote itself into every breath, every cough, every death certificate. To question it was to question the foundation of life itself. People accepted their choking as part of existence. the way one accepts rain or winter. Yet the body did not accept so easily. It weakened, it gasped, it collapsed. Survival here was not endurance alone, it was submission. And so, with each breath, the city asked its price. It demanded a toll from the lungs, a tax upon the body. Some paid slowly, their coughs stretching into years. Others paid quickly, their lives extinguished in a single bitter winter. All paid, eventually. By dawn, rooftops smouldered like altars, offering smoke to a sky already heavy with it. The city stirred once more, coughing itself awake. London was alive, yes, but its breath was poison. And to share that breath was to sign your life away, one lungful at a time. The air could choke, but at least one could turn from it, find brief shelter behind closed shutters, wipe soot from the skin, and imagine a moment's reprieve. Water, however, offered no escape. It was the most intimate of poisons, drawn into the body willingly, swallowed with trust, coursing silently through the veins of the city. The Thames was London's heart, and yet its beat was diseased. By daylight, it looked sluggish, heavy, its surface smeared with a sheen of grease and filth that caught the dim light like tarnished metal. Barges slid along it with the weight of industry, their wakes stirring up the stench that clung to the water's edge. Those who lived along the riverbanks, labourers, hawkers, children, breathed not just coal smoke, but the damp perfume of decay. The city poured itself into the Thames. Every street, every alleyway, every chamber pot, every privy, all led downward to the same destination. Human waste mingled with animal carcasses, with blood from slaughterhouses, with runoff from tanneries. Whole districts flushed themselves into the current, as though the river were an infinite stomach. But it was not infinite. It grew foul, sluggish, and dark, until the water itself seemed to recoil against its burden. Still, this was the same water fetched for drinking, pumped upstream, drawn by buckets, ladled from public wells. It was scooped from the very tide that had become London's open sewer. Families filled jugs without hesitation, because what other choice was there? The city's thirst was unrelenting, and thirst does not ask for purity. To sip from this water was to gamble with the invisible. Sometimes it tasted merely bitter, tinged with the faint flavour of rust or rot. Other times it carried no warning at all, clear to the eye, cool on the tongue, and yet within it swirled death, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, names that meant little until the fevers began. Illness spread like whispers in the winter cold. A child might drink one day and be doubled over the next, their body racked with cramps, their lips cracked from unquenchable thirst. Parents held basins for children who vomited what little they had swallowed, only to beg again for water that would kill them faster. The cruelest trick was the illusion of relief. Thirst drove the sick to drink more, and the more they drank, the closer the grave drew. Doctors spoke gravely of miasmas, of bad air rising from damp soil, of vapours that seeped into homes. They rarely pointed to the glass of water in a patient's hand. How could they? To condemn the water was to condemn the entire city's lifeline. So the people continued, gulping down sickness disguised as sustenance. Wealth softened the blow but did not erase it. The rich often imported bottled water or filtered their supplies through elaborate contraptions of sand and charcoal. They poured clear glasses in silvered parlours while outside, the poor bent over pumps that spat brownish liquid. Yet even the privileged were not immune. A contaminated barrel could find its way into a fine household, and no amount of silverware could disguise the agony of cholera's grip. Death knocked politely at gilded doors, as easily as it barged into tenements. The riverbanks told the truest story. Dead fish floated belly up, bobbing against timber piles. Dogs nosed at refuse, pulling scraps from the mud only to sicken themselves. Children played at the edge of the tide, their bare feet sinking into blackened silt, splashing in puddles that shimmered with oil. They laughed, unaware that their play was a dance with infection. By the time their mothers carried them home, shivering and fevered, the game had already exacted its toll. Watermen, whose trade was ferrying goods and passengers across the river, lived in this paradox daily. Their livelihood depended on a current they knew was lethal. They rode through waters so rank that the smell clung to their clothes for days, their hands raw from constant exposure. Yet even they filled their flasks from the same source, each swallow accompanied by the knowledge that necessity outweighed caution. The winter cold only worsened matters. Ice formed not clean and crystalline, but streaked with filth, trapping waste within its cloudy layers. Children chipped at it to suck on shards as if it were candy, their lips turning blue from cold and infection alike. When the ice thawed, it released its captive stench back into the flow, a reminder that London's poisons did not sleep, only paused. Public wells stood as gathering points, but also as silent conspirators in the city's undoing. Crowds pressed around, buckets clanging, women gossiping, children weaving through legs. Yet each ladle carried home more than water. Families unknowingly shared more than stories. They shared pathogens, passing invisible threads from neighbour to neighbour until whole streets succumbed. The graveyards swelled. Clergymen spoke of God's will, of the mystery of pestilence, while undertakers rubbed tired eyes and counted their profits. Whole rows of paupers' graves opened, filled with those who had only sought to ease their thirst. Death here was not a sudden catastrophe, but a steady rhythm, a tide that ebbed and flowed with each outbreak. And still, Londoners endured. They developed rituals of defiance, boiling water when they could spare the coal, mixing it with gin to dull the bitterness, praying over it, as though words could purify what the city could not. But coal was costly, gin was scarce, and prayer had no filter finer than sand. The smell of the Thames, thick and sour, mingled with coal smoke in the air, until one could not tell where the river ended and the sky began. London seemed to breathe and drink its own waste. A city cannibalizing itself in the name of survival. Those who visited from abroad recoiled at the first sip. Yet those who lived within the city had no choice but to adapt. Their stomachs hardened, but their bodies weakened, until resilience itself became a form of suffering. To refuse the water was to surrender to thirst. To drink it was to invite disease. There was no safe path, only the illusion of choice. In the chill of winter, when the body craved warmth and the throat demanded moisture, even the strongest will could not resist. And so the city consumed itself, glass by glass, bucket by bucket, life by life. The Thames rolled on, indifferent, carrying away the bodies of animals, the wash of industries, the waste of millions. It reflected the dim lamps of the riverfront, casting a shimmer that almost looked beautiful in the smoke-dimmed night. But beauty was only a trick of light. Beneath its surface, the water waited with patient malice, carrying not refreshment but ruin. To live in London's winter was to breathe poison with the lungs and drink poison with the lips. Every necessity of life, air, water, food, was tinged with death. And yet the city endured, sprawling, heaving, multiplying, its people dragging themselves forward through the fog and filth, as though survival were not a choice, but a duty. But water, more than smoke, more than cold, betrayed them most cruelly. For coal could be avoided by stepping outside, cold endured with an extra layer of rags, smoke tolerated with a rag at the mouth. But thirst was inescapable. And when the only answer to thirst was a cup filled with London's own corruption, survival itself became its own executioner. London in winter was not only the city of fog and sickness, it was also a city that crawled, gnawed, and multiplied in silence. Beneath the clatter of carts, the cries of hawkers, and the tolling bells of churches, another rhythm pulsed, quiet but relentless, the scratching, scurrying, and squealing of rats. They were the true inheritors of the streets, the shadow citizens who asked for nothing but took everything. The waste of millions gave them banquet halls. The riverbanks, sodden with rot, were their larders. The sewers, dark and sprawling, their highways. The tenements, warm with human misery, their citadels. Every household, rich or poor, knew the sound of tiny claws in the walls, the midnight rustle beneath the floorboards, the faint squeal that told you something alive was chewing closer to your bread. Rats did not care for class. In the alleys of Whitechapel, they darted between boots, bold as beggars. In the kitchens of Mayfair, they slipped behind coal ranges and dined on crumbs dropped from polished tables. The poor cursed them aloud. The rich pretended they did not exist, but none escaped their dominion. Rats moved through London like smoke through rafters, unseen until they chose to show themselves. Winter only sharpened their hunger. The cold pressed humans indoors, and with them came food stores tightly wrapped and jealously guarded. But rats had ways of finding weakness. A sack of flour gnawed open at the base, a wheel of cheese hollowed from within, meat hung in a cellar, its edges tested by yellowed teeth. And when food grew scarce, they did not hesitate to feast upon the dead, nor the living, if one lay helpless enough. It was whispered in the rookeries that infants sometimes disappeared not by theft, but by teeth. Mothers, half mad with exhaustion, swore they woke to find their children's tiny fingers bloodied, gnawed while they slept. Whether truth or terror-fed rumour, the belief itself revealed the depth of fear. To close one's eyes was to risk surrendering not just possessions, but flesh. Rats thrived where humans faltered. Cholera emptied houses, but the rats remained. Famine thinned bellies, but the rats grew fat. Fire blackened walls, and from the ashes they emerged, whiskers twitching, unscathed. In a city where the living staggered under the weight of winter, the rats marched as though nothing could touch them. They were the one constant in the chaos, the silent army that neither coal smoke nor frost could weaken. Their numbers were impossible to count. Some said they outnumbered humans 10 to 1, others more. One only had to lift a sewer grate to believe such estimates. The tunnels roiled with them, slick bodies writhing over one another, eyes glinting red in lantern light. The sewer system, hailed as the marvel of engineering in later years, was in those days a labyrinth of filth that belonged less to people than to rodents. Men who worked down there told stories of feeling watched, followed by 1,000 beady eyes as they sloshed through knee-deep muck. Markets bore witness to their audacity. A stall left unattended for a breath was swarmed. Fruit tumbled, bread vanished, scraps devoured before the hawker even turned his head. Children tasked with guarding baskets would stamp and shout, but rats scattered only to return seconds later, fearless in their persistence. Hunger made them bold, winter made them desperate, and the city's endless refuse made them unkillable. Killing was, of course, attempted. Cats were kept in kitchens, terriers bred for the hunt, men employed as rat catchers with sacks and sticks. Some households paid handsomely for the promise of vermin-free cellars. But the rats always came back. Catchers bragged of dozens slain in an hour, yet for every one killed, 10 more seemed to appear. London itself was too fertile a breeding ground, too generous in its filth. Rat baiting became a grim form of entertainment. Crowds gathered in taverns to watch dogs unleashed upon cages filled with squealing prey. Bets were placed on how many could be slaughtered in a set time. Men cheered, dogs tore, and blood painted the sawdust floors. Yet even as the corpses piled high, the victory was hollow. The rats outside carried on, unbothered, their empire untouched. And it was not only hunger they carried. Fleas travelled in their fur, tiny passengers bearing invisible curses. Diseases spread from rat to rat, rat to human, human to street, until no boundary remained. Though the Black Death was a tale of earlier centuries, its ghost still lingered in these vermin, and in the winter nights of Victorian London, that memory was enough to send shivers colder than the frost. To sleep was to share your space with them. Families huddled in single rooms, bodies pressed close against the cold, only to hear the scuttling in corners. A loaf of bread was placed under a blanket to keep it safe, only to be found gnawed by morning. Rats squeezed through cracks no wider than a thumb, their bodies impossibly flexible, their hunger limitless. A candle guttering low might reveal a dozen eyes gleaming back from the shadows, watching, waiting for silence. In the grand houses, servants told of rats gnawing through wainscoting, leaving droppings in silver drawers. In the workhouses, the poor lay awake listening to squeaks and squeals that never ceased. In prisons, where despair already rotted the air, rats served as both tormentors and companions, feeding on scraps tossed into cells, sometimes even crawling across sleeping convicts, as if to remind them that freedom was irrelevant. The rats held dominion everywhere. Children, resilient in their innocence, sometimes turned this plague into play. They tied strings to the tails of captured rats, parading them like pets. Street boys tossed them in fights, testing their teeth against dogs or one another. To them, rats were both enemy and entertainment, a fact of life as common as fog. But laughter could not hide the truth. Each rat was another mouth in a city already starved, another vessel for sickness in a city already diseased. The poorest, in moments of desperation, did the unthinkable. A rat, skinned and cooked, provided meat when none else could be found. Hunger makes no distinction between delicacy and disgust. What once squeaked in the shadows could end up simmering in a pot, bones picked clean by the same hands that had cursed its existence hours before. Survival, after all, demands compromises that comfort cannot imagine. The winter streets belonged to them as much as to any man. While humans stumbled through fog, clutching their bellies and coughing into rags, the rats thrived, breeding in the warmth of dung heaps and the cracks of cellar walls. They were not hindered by disease, they spread it. They were not weakened by famine, they fed upon it. London was theirs as much as it was anyone's, and unlike the fragile bodies of men and women, they seemed impervious to the season's cruelty. To stand in a Victorian winter was to know that you were never alone. Even in silence, even in darkness, the rats were there. They slithered beneath floorboards, gnawed behind the plaster, darted across alleys with a confidence born of centuries. They required nothing from you but the inevitability of your waste, your weakness, your death. And so the city's suffering had an audience, a restless, endless audience of gnawing teeth and watching eyes. The rats thrived on the failures of humanity, and in London's winter there was no shortage of failure to feast upon. In that season of coal smoke, poisoned water, and hunger gnawing from within, the rats marched as the unspoken victors. They carried no banners, no voices, no faces, only a relentless tide of fur and teeth. An army that asked for no quarter, an army that could not be starved, an army that multiplied while humans perished. The silent army of rats was not an invasion, it was a reminder that in London, survival did not belong to man, nor to wealth, nor to power. It belonged to those who could adapt to filth, who could thrive in decay, who could find feast in famine. And in that winter, no one did so better than the rats. The scratching in the walls, the squeals in the cellars, the constant gnawing in the night. Londoners answered them not with silence, but with flame. Candles were the weapon of the weary, the fragile line drawn against the crawling dark. Yet these small flames, far from delivering safety, became another cruel reminder of how survival in a Victorian winter was an illusion. The city was lit, not by abundance, but by shadows. Candles flickered in cramped rooms. Oil lamps swung in taverns. Gas lamps lined the main thoroughfares like weary sentries. But none of it banished the darkness. Instead, the light only carved out pockets of trembling visibility, leaving every corner beyond as a stage for dread. To walk through London in winter was not to see, but to imagine. Shapes that might be man or post, footsteps that might be friend or predator, alleys that might conceal only refuse or something far hungrier. The poor knew this fear most intimately. A candle was a luxury, its wax burned carefully, each inch rationed against the long stretch of night. Families huddled around one flame as if it were a sun, stretching their hands to its fragile glow while cold crept behind their backs. When it guttered low, the room was surrendered to blackness, and with it came the certainty that rats, thieves, or worse, now had free rein. But candlelight was not kindness even when it burned. It distorted faces, hollowed cheeks, cast eyes into pools of shadow. A mother's worn features looked skeletal in its glow. A child's shivering frame became ghost-like. The flame revealed, but it also haunted. It was not uncommon for Londoners to describe their own rooms as menacing after dark, familiar walls turned foreign by the unsteady dance of fire. The wealthy, with chandeliers strung high and oil lamps polished bright, believed themselves spared from such gloom, yet shadows crept even into drawing rooms. Every flame brought risk. A sleeve brushed too close, a curtain catching, a coal spark leaping from a grate. Fire was as constant a presence as cold, and often far deadlier. Entire rows of houses had been reduced to smouldering skeletons because a single candle toppled in the night. In tenements, where families stacked upon families, this danger was multiplied. A single overturned flame could race through the building before shouts even reached the street. The poor, already weakened by hunger and illness, found themselves leaping from windows or buried beneath collapsing beams. Neighbours spoke of screams swallowed by the roar of fire, of silhouettes thrashing in windows before falling silent. Survivors stood barefoot in the snow, their breath steaming, watching the last of their possessions curl into ash. And yet, fire was indispensable. To live without it was to freeze, to stumble blind, to surrender completely to the night. Candles were bought with the last pennies, stolen from churches, begged from merchants. Children were sent to the streets with jars to collect spilled oil, or the drippings of wax left behind after processions. Even when the flame betrayed them, Londoners could not turn away. The streets themselves told a darker story. Gas lamps, hailed as progress, were few and far between, their faint halos swallowed by fog and smoke. In poorer districts, they were rare enough to make no difference at all. Beyond their pale pools of light, the alleys were black tunnels where every sound carried weight. A footstep echoed like pursuit. A whisper slithered like a threat. Thieves and cutthroats thrived here, cloaked not in silence but in the certainty that their faces would never be seen. To step into those streets after sundown was to accept that shadows might be the last companions you knew. The constables' lanterns swung too far away, their boots too slow to answer cries for help. Men vanished into alleys for the promise of gin or warmth, only to emerge as bodies, stripped and battered if they emerged at all. Women hurried with shawls drawn tight, their pace quickened by footsteps that always seemed to follow a beat too close behind. Even within the home, the shadows were unkind. Rats darted just beyond the reach of the flame, their eyes gleaming like pinpricks before disappearing again. Families whispered of shapes that moved in corners, convinced it was more than vermin. The sick groaned on pallets, their faces half lit, looking more like corpses than patients. The candle did not soften their suffering. It etched it in cruel relief. Children learned to fear their own rooms. A doll's face leered in the half-light. A coat on a peg swelled into a lurking figure. The shiver of shadows on the wall seemed to breathe. They cried for the candle to be left burning, but wax was precious, and mothers pinched wicks to darkness while promising comfort. They did not feel themselves. The psychological weight was as heavy as the physical cold. Darkness bred suspicion. A knock on the door was cause for dread. Was it a neighbour, a thief, or the constable come with bad news? A figure glimpsed across the street, might be friend by day, but seemed stranger, menacing, under gaslight haze. London was a city of millions, but candlelight made it feel like a place of phantoms, each man isolated in his fragile circle of flame. Crime swelled with the shadows. Thieves waited near extinguished lamps. Footpads sprang from doorways. Pickpockets worked by the glow of tavern lights. Entire professions thrived because the city could not defend itself against its own night. There was no safety in numbers when fear kept eyes downward and lips closed. A scream heard through fog was a sound to be avoided, not answered. And still, people carried on. Men trudged to work at dawn, lanterns in hand, the glass fogged by their breath. Women lit small tapers to sew late into the evening, the thread glinting faintly in the wavering glow. Taverns blazed with candles as men sought to drink away the darkness itself. Every flame was a declaration, however small, against the crushing night. Yet those flames consumed not only wax, but hope. Each stub of candle represented another coin gone, another trade-off between light and food, between warmth and survival. A family might eat less so that one flame could burn longer. A mother might choose darkness rather than risk fire. Each decision chipped away at the fragile illusion of safety. London, drenched in candlelight shadows, was a city caught between two deaths, one by darkness, one by fire. The flame flickered, promising safety, while its very presence threatened ruin. Shadows leapt and stretched, whispering that no corner was truly safe, no face entirely known. To survive such nights was not triumph, it was chance. And so the city endured its winters not in brilliance, but in trembling circles of light, surrounded always by darkness that pressed close, heavy, unrelenting. The flame was both savior and traitor, casting not comfort, but distortion. A reminder that in London, even light could not be trusted. To walk its streets, to sit in its homes, to sleep beneath its wavering glow, was to live in a constant state of unease. For in a city of fog, filth, hunger and rats, the night itself was another enemy, and candlelight, far from banishing it, only revealed how close it had always been. When the darkness outside grew too heavy, and the cold inside gnawed too deep, many had no choice but to seek what the city called refuge. London had its answer for the destitute, its great machine of charity and discipline, a place where survival was promised in name but seldom in spirit. The workhouse. These were not havens, they were monuments of punishment built to remind the poor that hunger and cold were preferable to charity. Their walls rose stark against the fog, brick and stone stripped of ornament, looming not as shelters, but as fortresses. Their gates swallowed the desperate one by one, and once inside, winter pressed upon them in ways more cruel than on the streets. The first step was surrender. To enter a workhouse, one gave up freedom, family bonds, possessions, dignity. Husbands were separated from wives, children torn from parents. The units of life dissolved, as though poverty itself had erased kinship. This division was not incidental, but deliberate. The workhouse was designed to break bonds, to remind each soul that survival was not a right, but a privilege to be earned under watchful eyes. Inside, the air was no warmer than the streets. The stone walls held cold like iron. Dormitories were bare. Rows of pallets stretched across cavernous rooms, where coughing and crying echoed all night. Thin blankets offered little against the frost. Those too weak to shift beneath the covers sometimes froze silently, discovered stiff by morning. Others woke to find themselves pressed against corpses, the line between sleep and death blurred in the dim light. Food was no reprieve. The fare was thin gruel, coarse bread, sometimes a shred of cheese or meat, so small it only sharpened hunger rather than soothed it. Each portion was carefully measured, calculated to sustain, but never to satisfy. Eating was less nourishment than reminder. You were here because you had failed, and even survival would taste of punishment. Labor filled every waking hour. Men broke stones, picked oakum, turned cranks. Women scrubbed, sewed, laundered, their hands red and cracked from cold water. Children worked too, their small fingers forced into nimble tasks, their thin bodies bent under loads. Work did not end when the body begged for rest. It ended when overseers decided. Exhaustion was not a byproduct, it was the method. Punishments waited for any lapse. Talking out of turn, resting too long, failing to complete a task. Infractions were met with confinement, reduced rations, or worse. Overseers walked with sticks, their authority unquestioned. To be poor was to be guilty, and the workhouse was the trial. the sentence, and the execution of spirit all at once. And yet, for many, this was better than the streets. Outside there was only hunger, exposure, the gnawing of rats, the uncertainty of night. Inside, at least, there was a roof. Inside, one might live another week. It was a cruel trade. Dignity for survival, family for bread, freedom for warmth. But winter does not bargain kindly, and the poor learned that survival itself could become a prison. Disease moved easily through these walls. Close quarters made every cough a threat, every fever a contagion. Entire wards fell ill within days, the sick lying in rows while nurses, poor themselves, often unpaid, did what little they could. There was no isolation, no escape. Illness spread faster than comfort. To enter the workhouse sick was often to leave in a coffin. Death did not shock here. It was routine. Corpses were carried quietly out at dawn, carted away to paupers' graves without ceremony. Names were recorded in ledgers, neat and orderly, as though the loss of a life were no more than an entry in an account book. The living shuffled onto their tasks, their eyes hollow, their bodies thinner each week, as if already rehearsing their own exits. Children suffered most cruelly. Orphans swelled the ranks, their small bodies folded into dormitories, their futures dictated by overseers who believed discipline was more valuable than care. They were schooled not in warmth or joy, but in obedience and silence. Their laughter died quickly in those halls, replaced by the dull rhythm of labor. Winter pressed especially hard on them, their fragile frames ill-equipped to endure thin rations and cold stone. Many never reached adulthood. Yet, the workhouse was always full. London's winters saw to that. Frostbitten men staggered to the gates when their bodies could no longer bear the cold. Mothers, their children gaunt and coughing, begged for admittance when starvation had stripped them of choice. The workhouse consumed them all, one after another, until its halls overflowed. There was no dignity in leaving. Those who managed to escape the grip of poverty often carried its mark forever. A hollowed body, a spirit bent, a face aged beyond its years. Neighbours knew who had been inside, and the stigma clung as tightly as frost to cobblestones. Charity in London was not a gift, but a brand, a scar that reminded you, and everyone else, that you had once been defeated. The city spoke of workhouses as solutions, as bulwarks against poverty, as proof of moral order. But the truth was clear in every cough that echoed through their halls, in every corpse cart that left their gates. They were not sanctuaries, but slow engines of death, grinding the poor into submission until the grave offered the only release. For the destitute in a Victorian winter, survival meant choosing between the street and the workhouse, between cold and cruelty, between hunger and humiliation. Neither path promised life, both promised suffering. It was only a matter of what kind. London endured because its people endured, but endurance was not survival. It was dragging one's body through the motions while the soul froze somewhere along the way. In the workhouses of endless winter, men and women lived on, but only in the narrowest sense of the word. The walls of those places stand even now in memory, cold and unyielding, reminders that in Victorian London, poverty was not an accident but a crime, and survival was its punishment. The sound came first, a dull, uneven thud of wheels rolling over cobblestones slick with frost, accompanied by the hollow clatter of iron rims that never seemed to stop echoing. In the cold breath of Victorian London, the rattle of death's carriage was as constant as the fog. It wound its way through alleys and squares, across market roads, and down the lanes behind the workhouses, pulled by tired horses whose breath plumed like ghosts in the night. To live in the city during winter was to live with that sound, a reminder that death was not an intruder but a daily guest, making its rounds without discrimination. The poor knew it best. They saw the black carts halt at their doorways, the men in heavy coats, climbing down to collect bodies stiffened by cold or thinned by hunger. But even the wealthier districts could not silence the wheels. for disease ignored wealth, and the fog did not distinguish between silk curtains and broken shutters. The carriages were crude, no ornate hearses, no carven wood adorned with mourning symbols. These were practical vehicles of removal, black or brown, sometimes plain planks fitted together, other times converted wagons borrowed from tradesmen. The horses, lean from overwork, knew the routes as well as their drivers. They trudged tirelessly, hooves slipping on ice, leaving behind a mix of mud and blood on the stones. The drivers spoke little. Their work demanded silence. They lifted bodies with rough efficiency, sometimes wrapped in shrouds, sometimes still in the thin rags the poor had died wearing. The dead were stacked, not laid, the carts filling with human cargo as though they carried nothing more than sacks of coal. Death, after all, was business, and in London winter it was booming. Funerals followed in their wake, though funeral was a generous word. For the wealthy, there were plumes, velvet drapes, and carriages lined in black, though even they could not escape the choking fog and the bitter cold that seeped into every graveyard. But for the poor, burial was swift and unceremonious. The pauper's cart delivered bodies to common pits, mass graves where names dissolved into ledgers and wood markers rotted before the next frost. One coffin often held several, or none at all if cost demanded only a winding sheet. The cemeteries strained under the weight. Earth was frozen hard, and digging through it took hours of back-breaking labour, often done by men half frozen themselves. The ground, when it opened, released old stench, for the pits were shallow and overcrowded, bones pushing back toward the surface. Graveyards overflowed into the city itself. Houses backed onto burial grounds where children played on mounds that were not earth alone, and winter rains washed soil away to expose what lay beneath. It was not unusual for the living to dine in taverns, with the odour of decay drifting in from the graveyard next door, nor for markets to sell vegetables grown in soil, enriched by decomposing bodies. London consumed its dead as surely as it consumed its poor. The carriages rolled day and night, their work uninterrupted by the clock. At dawn, they collected the starved who had not risen from their workhouse pallets. By noon, they hauled children carried from alleys, their faces pale as porcelain dolls. By dusk, they stopped at grander homes, where influenza had taken fathers and mothers despite roaring fireplaces and featherbeds. At midnight, they rattled again, wheels echoing in fog-thick streets where the only other sound was the gnawing of rats. There was no corner of the city where one might hide from them. Children learned to step aside when they heard the wheels approach. Shopkeepers paused mid-sale as the carts passed, tipping their hats in grim acknowledgement. Even the dogs fell silent, sensing in the procession something not to be barked at. For those inside the carriages, there was no ceremony of farewell. A man might vanish from his family in the morning, his body carted off by dusk, his grave filled by night. Families were forbidden to follow the pauper carts. There was no space, no allowance for grief. The separation was final, sharp as frost. You lived, and then you were carted. That was the rhythm of winter in London. The poor whispered that you could tell the city's health by the frequency of the wheels. When they rattled endlessly, London was sick. And when their silence stretched longer than usual, it meant a brief reprieve, a mercy of milder air. But winter offered few such mercies. Cholera, typhus, influenza, all thrived in the damp, the crowded, the cold. The city itself seemed designed to nourish them. In narrow lanes, where air barely stirred and sewage seeped beneath the cobbles, diseases spread faster than gossip. One coughing neighbour meant 10 more within a week. The workhouses, crammed and unsanitary, amplified the contagion. Hospitals overflowed and turned away the dying, sending them back to their cold beds, where the carriage would find them soon enough. Doctors wrote reports. Reformers cried out for change. But the wheels did not pause. They ground onward, indifferent to policy, untouched by outrage. Death's carriage moved not with malice, but with inevitability. The sound of survival denied in a city where winter pressed every weakness into finality. And yet, London adapted. florists thrived, selling funeral wreaths to grieving families who could still afford flowers. Coffin makers found steady trade, their workshops hammering late into the night. Churches filled with mourners, their hymns muffled by fog, while nearby taverns filled with the laughter of those still living, drinking hard, against the knowledge that the carriage might stop at their door tomorrow. Death, in its constancy, became woven into daily life, as present as the chiming of bells or the toll of factory whistles. Children grew up knowing its shape. They played at funerals, fashioning carriages out of boxes, pulling one another along while pretending to weep. In their games, as in life, the cart always arrived, and someone always lay stiff inside. What began as imitation became expectation. They learned early what awaited them. The wealthier districts may have wished to separate themselves from such grim reminders, but the fog carried everything: smoke, smell, sound. The wheels rattled through Mayfair as surely as through Whitechapel. No one, however insulated, could deny the rhythm of mortality that echoed across the city. And so the carriages became symbols, not of honour, not of reverence, but of inevitability. In a winter where warmth was scarce, food scarce, clean water scarce, the only thing that moved freely, endlessly, without restriction, was the cart. Its path was as certain as the fog, as certain as the frost, as certain as hunger itself. For the poor, survival meant not only enduring the cold, but dodging the carriage for one more day. Yet the odds were rarely in their favour. Every cough in a crowded dormitory, every sip from a tainted well, every night a shivering beneath a threadbare blanket, tilted the balance toward the cart, and when it came, there was no resistance to be made. The wheels rolled on, through alleys, through courts, through boulevards, collecting the winter's toll. Londoners walked quickly when they heard them coming, eyes down, breath held, as though superstition alone could ward off death. But the carriages knew no superstition. They knew only routes and schedules and the endless work of winter. In those months, the city became less a place of the living than a waiting room for the grave. The fog covered it, the cold pressed it, and the carts confirmed it. Life was not measured in years, but in how many times one could hear the carriage pass without it stopping at one's own door. And always, the sound of the wheels lingered in the fog, echoing off stone and river, until it became impossible to tell whether it was the city breathing or dying. The carriages of the dead had little patience for ceremony, yet their absence was never silence. For in the very hours when one life was hauled away to the grave, another was out on the streets clawing for survival. Nowhere was this more visible than in the markets, those sprawling veins of commerce where Londoners came not merely to buy, but to stave off starvation for one more day. The markets were alive, but not with comfort. They were alive with desperation. Even before dawn, when the fog clung so thick it blurred the lamps into smudges of light, the stalls were already being set. Wooden tables creaked beneath heaps of goods, some fresh, many foul, all exposed to the merciless winter air. The smell was a mingling of smoke, rotting cabbage, dried fish, manure, and damp wool, an odour so dense it seemed to cling to the throat. Those who came to buy carried the frost on their faces. Men with cracked lips and women with hands wrapped in rags shuffled among the stalls, their breath fogging as they haggled with traders. Children clung to skirts or darted between legs, their eyes wide with hunger and their noses running from the cold. Every face told the same story, not of luxury, but of calculation. How much bread would a coin buy today? Would the scraps of meat last the night? Could a cabbage leaf be stretched into soup enough to trick the belly into stillness? The wealthier buyers stood out, their coats thicker, their voices louder, their coins shining brighter in the dim light. But even they did not escape the chill. Fur collars and polished boots could only do so much against the wind that sliced down alleyways and across open squares. Frost bit the cheeks of lords and beggars alike, and the air turned every bargain into a race against numb fingers and stiff jaws. Vendors fought their own battles. Fishmongers shouted above the din, their breath clouding over heaps of cod and haddock that stiffened in the cold until their scales glistened like ice. But not all was fresh. The same frost that preserved also disguised. Stale fish, days old, could be sold under the winter's cover, its stench masked by the general reek of the market. Housewives, desperate and untrained, often discovered the truth only when the pot was boiling back home. Butchers fared no better. Carcasses hung stiff on hooks, frost forming on the edges where fat met bone. Rats darted at their feet, bold enough to steal scraps from the ground. The meat itself was often grey, stretched thin with water or bulked with gristle. For those who could not afford even that, butchers sold bones, bare, gnawed clean, but still capable of lending flavour to boiling water. In some households, a pot of bone broth was the only meal of the day, its thinness a cruel reflection of the hunger it tried to mask. Vegetables, too, bore the mark of winter. Potatoes green with age, cabbages wilted and slimy, onions sprouting in their crates, all found buyers among those who had no choice. The vendors piled them high, calling out their virtues, while frost laced their leaves like mockery. Hunger softened judgment. What could fill the belly was more important than what might sicken it. And still, the market thrived with voices. Shouts of vendors mingled with the cries of infants, the barking of dogs, the crack of whips as carts jostled through narrow passages. The sound was ceaseless, a living roar rising from frostbitten lips, carrying the rhythm of survival, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of misery, people bartering not with confidence, but with the urgency of those who knew a mispurchase might mean an empty stomach by nightfall. The cold turned even these small exchanges into ordeals. Hands stiffened until coins slipped through fingers. Lips cracked so badly that every word of haggling was a small wound. To touch goods meant exposing skin to frost, and to linger meant risking numbness that would not leave for hours. Buyers stamped their feet, clutched at their shawls, and pressed on, not because they wished to, but because the body demanded it. Among them moved the silent army of the destitute, those without even a penny to barter. They hovered at the edges, children with hollow eyes staring at loaves of bread, men feigning interest in rotten apples as though deciding a purchase, women whispering prayers as they waited for scraps. Some stole, their hands darting quickly toward a stall, hoping hunger would lend them speed. Others begged openly, their pleas often ignored, their frostbitten faces indistinguishable from the fog. Winter made even charity sting. A stallholder might toss a spoiled carrot toward a beggar child, not in kindness, but in irritation, as one might throw off a dog. The child would snatch it eagerly, teeth breaking through frozen flesh, while others watched with envy. Hunger reduced the market to a theatre of survival, where pride withered as quickly as cabbage leaves, and where the only rule was endurance. The faces told the rest. Lips blue from cold, cheeks raw from wind, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. Children's ears cracked and bled beneath thin caps. Old men shivered uncontrollably, their bodies no longer able to generate the heat required to survive the endless hours in the square. Frostbite crept silently across fingers and toes, blackening flesh even as its owners haggled for bread. Some lost digits, others lost lives. And still the crowd pressed on, because hunger was stronger than pain. The markets did not end with daylight. As the lamps were lit and shadows stretched, vendors lingered to sell what they could not afford to take home. Firelight glowed from braziers where chestnuts roasted, their aroma momentarily comforting. But even that warmth came at a price. A penny bought a handful, and for many, even that was too dear. So they huddled near the heat, eyes closed, letting the smoke sting their lungs for a moment's illusion of comfort before moving on. Night did not empty the stalls. Instead, it changed them. Thieves prowled, cutting purses from distracted buyers. Prostitutes circled, their offers mingling with the calls of vendors, survival taking every form the city demanded. Policemen patrolled, their batons visible, though their presence did little to soothe the unease. The market at night was not only about food, it was about endurance in all its desperate disguises. And through it all, the frost deepened. It clung to the edges of barrels, crept across the rims of baskets, glazed the cobblestones until every step was a risk. Faces grew harder as the hours passed, the weariness of hunger mingling with the ache of cold until expression itself seemed to freeze. Those who could return home did so with arms full, but spirits heavy, already calculating how long their purchases would last. Those with nothing drifted back to doorways and alleys, bellies empty, faces blank, their breath vanishing into the night like the very souls of the city. The market was proof that life continued, but not proof that it flourished. It was a place where survival was visible, tangible, fought for with every coin, every bargain, every scrap. Yet it was also a mirror, showing a city that demanded resilience from its poor while giving them only frost in return. To walk through the market was to walk through a gallery of endurance painted in hunger and cold, a place where each frostbitten face was both a warning and a prophecy. And if one listened closely, beneath the clamour and the haggling, the sound of the death cart could still be heard in the distance, wheels rattling toward another house, another alley, another soul who had found nothing in the market but the sharp bite of winter itself. The markets emptied at night, but the river never slept. London's heart was the Thames, and even in the sharpest frost it continued to breathe, though its breath carried more sickness than salvation. By day, its surface glittered with shards of ice, drifting like broken glass in the current. By night, it swallowed lantern light black and endless, a ribbon of shadow winding through the city. For centuries, it had been London's lifeline. By the 19th, it had become its curse. Winter pressed hard against the river. Some mornings its edges froze so thick that barges could not dock, and men with poles broke the ice in great sheets that floated downstream, cracking against the banks with hollow thuds. Children dared to creep onto its frozen edges, sliding until the ice groaned beneath their feet. But the river never froze entirely, not in these winters, not in these times. It carried too much filth, too much waste, too much of the city itself. The heat of corruption kept it alive, churning beneath the frost like a beast with fever. It was here that London's refuse flowed. Every household, every tavern, every market emptied its bowels into the river. The drains, clogged with grease and soot, carried more than rain. Human waste, rotting vegetables, dead animals, all poured into the current until the Thames was less water than broth, thick and dark, its stench rising like a second fog. Even in freezing weather, when smells ought to have dulled, the river reeked. The poor who lived along its banks learned not to breathe too deeply when the wind shifted, and yet they drank from it. They had no choice. The wells in poorer districts were shallow and fouled. Pumps drew water that tasted of iron and disease. The river, for all its filth, was abundant. Women came with pails, breaking the thin crust of ice with sticks, scooping water into buckets that steamed in the air. They carried it home, boiled it when they could afford coal, prayed that heat would kill what lurked within. But fever still followed. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all rose from those pails and settled into bellies, spreading faster than any fire through households already weakened by hunger. The Thames gave sickness a stage. Winter's cold slowed little. If anything, it deepened the misery, for icy winds kept windows closed, trapping foul air inside crowded rooms. A single tainted bucket could claim an entire family within days. Doctors came, shook their heads, and left. Their medicines were powerless against what flowed from the river. The poor whispered of curses, of invisible demons in the water, while reformers spoke of invisible germs. But whatever the language, the outcome was the same. Swollen bellies, endless vomiting, bodies shivering with fever beneath threadbare blankets until the death cart arrived. The river carried away the dead as well. Pauper funerals sometimes ended with coffins weighted and dropped into the current. In storms, coffins washed loose from graveyards along its banks, their contents spilling back into the tide. Children playing along the shore found bones half buried in mud, tugging them free as though unearthing some grim treasure. Winter rains swelled the current, lifting filth and corpses alike into a single flowing mass. But the river was not only for the poor. Great mansions stood along its banks, their windows catching the weak winter sun. Barges carried coal to factories, ships unloaded goods from across the empire, their sails stiff with frost. The Thames was commerce, movement, empire. Yet even here, death clung. Sailors drank from its water and fell ill. Workers unloading cargo breathed its stench until their lungs rebelled. Disease did not care if a man wore velvet or rags. The river flowed for all, and it carried sickness indiscriminately. There were times, in the hardest winters, when the river turned spectacle. Crowds gathered on the banks to watch frost fairs, makeshift carnivals when the ice was thick enough to hold tents and fires. Booths were set up, meat roasted. Skaters twirled on frozen stretches. For a few days, laughter rang out over the black current. But these were dangerous illusions. The ice cracked without warning, swallowing children, dogs, and sometimes whole stalls. Beneath the revelry, the river still churned, carrying disease even as it bore the weight of Londoners celebrating their defiance of it. For those who lived by it, however, the Thames was no carnival. Watermen rowed through ice-choked channels, their faces raw with wind, their boats laden with passengers too poor to ride carriages. Fishermen hauled nets that came up heavy with sludge, the fish within pale and sickly, their flesh soft from the poisons of the current. Some were sold anyway, fried in grease and offered in the markets, their diseased flesh hidden beneath salt and smoke. Children scavenged the mudflats at low tide, their small bodies hunched against the cold as they sifted through refuse for rags, bones and coal washed downstream. These mudlarks, as they were called, walked barefoot even in winter, their skin cracked and bleeding, their faces smeared with the filth of the city. They laughed sometimes, played among the carcasses and dead dogs, but disease followed them home like a shadow. Few grew to adulthood. Even the river's fog was treacherous. It rolled thick across the water, blinding boatmen, muffling sound. Barges collided in silence, their crews swallowed whole by the black current. Men staggered off wharves and vanished without a splash, their bodies recovered weeks later, bloated and unrecognizable. The fog did not kill alone. It hid the river's hunger, cloaking its edge until one step too many carried a soul from frost into drowning. In winter, survival meant proximity to water, yet the Thames gave only poisoned sustenance. The poor lined up with buckets, dipping them into the flow that would sicken them by nightfall. The rich raised windows against its stench, but its air seeped through cracks, carrying the same pestilence. No one was untouched. The river was both artery and infection, lifeblood and rot, flowing endlessly through the city that depended on it. Those who succumbed to its poisons often did so quickly. A man might leave the market with a bucket of water, drink by afternoon, and by evening lie doubled in pain. His skin would flush, his eyes glaze, his body expel everything within it until there was nothing left but spasms. Families watched in horror, unable to help, waiting for the inevitable stillness. And then the carriage came, its wheels rattling over cobblestones. Another body claimed by a river that gave and took with equal cruelty. The Thames flowed on, indifferent. Ice cracked and reformed. Barges passed. Children scavenged. Markets sold fish from its depths. Life clung to it because life had no choice. But beneath the frost, it remained a grave, a carrier of sickness, a mirror that reflected not resilience, but desperation. The city called it the silver thread of empire, the artery of commerce, the pride of London. But in winter, it showed its truest face, black, poisoned, rimmed with frost, a current that whispered with every lap against the shore that survival here was always borrowed time. And so, when one asked why life in a Victorian winter was so fragile, so easily extinguished, the answer was never far. It flowed endlessly through the city, a river that both froze and festered, offering no escape, only the illusion of it, until the body failed, and the wheels of the death cart took over once more. The carts clattered endlessly over the cobblestones, carrying bodies claimed by frost, filth, and the river's poisons. But for those not yet taken, those who shivered, coughed, or cried out in fever, there was still one more figure to summon, one more desperate hope to cling to: the doctor. He arrived at all hours, his coat dark with soot, his boots caked in mud, his bag swinging at his side. To the desperate, he looked like salvation stepping out of the fog, but under the glow of a guttering lamp, when his face appeared through the shadows, what showed was fatigue, resignation, and the knowledge of futility. He had seen too many die and too few recover. He carried medicine, but medicine here was not a cure. It was theatre, ritual, something to pass the time before the inevitable. Doctors in Victorian London walked into rooms where disease clung to the walls like frost. Families gathered, holding rags to their mouths, watching their loved ones writhe beneath blankets too thin to block the cold. The air reeked of sweat and sickness. The doctor knelt, touched a clammy forehead, listened to rattling breath, then reached into his bag. From it came glass vials, brown powders, leeches in jars. He opened them with the practiced motions of a man who knew he was expected to do something, anything, even if nothing would work. Leeches sucked weakly at blue-veined skin. Powders of mercury or antimony slid down parched throats, leaving behind burns that outlasted the fever. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, dulled pain, but drew patients closer to death's edge with each spoonful. Some doctors bled their patients, believing poison left with the crimson drops. Others dosed with arsenic in minuscule amounts, hoping the body would be shocked into balance. Each treatment was as likely to hasten the end as to postpone it. But to do nothing was worse, for then the family would whisper that the doctor had not tried. And so he tried, over and over, night after night, trudging from one frostbitten street to another. His bag grew lighter as his spirits did. He could ease pain, but not stop its source. The water remained fouled, the air remained choked, the food remained scarce. A doctor could not mend what the city itself kept breaking. In the alleys where the poor lived, doctors were often not doctors at all. They were apothecaries with mixtures of herbs, or women with bottles of gin labelled medicine. Some were quacks with miracle cures promising to banish cholera or consumption for a penny. Their advertisements screamed from posters nailed to walls already peeling in the damp. Elixirs of life, powders for every affliction. Breathe easy with patent remedies. Desperate families spent their last coins on these concoctions, only to watch their loved ones decline further. Bellies bloated, mouths foaming, limbs jerking until stillness claimed them. Even licensed doctors were little better, though they wore fine coats and signed prescriptions with practiced flourish. They studied anatomy, but germs were not yet known. They spoke of miasma, bad air rising from rotting matter, as the root of disease. They instructed families to open windows, but winter's bite made that impossible. They advised cleanliness, but water itself was poison. They advised rest, but who could rest when hunger gnawed and cold chewed at the bones? Hospitals stood as monuments of medicine, yet inside them, the air was colder than the streets. Beds lined wall after wall, crowded so close that one man's cough became another's death sentence. Blankets were shared, vermin skittered across floors, and the smell of blood, sweat, and chloroform lingered like an unholy incense. Surgeons cut quickly, knives flashing in lamplight, while assistants held screaming men down. There was no anesthesia but ether or opium, both dangerous, both scarce. Patients either endured the pain or never woke from the haze. Wounds festered, turning black at the edges, flies circling even in winter's chill. Amputations left stumps that wet pus until the body gave up. Consumption, the slow wasting of tuberculosis, was the winter's constant companion. Coughs echoed in every court and alley, blood-spotted handkerchiefs, staining them like signatures of doom. The doctors listened with stethoscopes pressed to rattling chests, shook their heads, and prescribed rest, fresh air, and milk. Rest was impossible, fresh air was poisoned, and milk was often watered down with the river's filth. Families watched as their loved ones wasted away, their faces hollowing, their breath shortening, their eyes staring at some horizon beyond the frost. Cholera came faster. It struck without mercy, twisting bowels, draining the body until it shriveled like a husk. Doctors arrived too late, more often than not. They tried laudanum, calomel, bleeding, each as useless as the last. They wrote notes, filled ledgers, reported cases, but the numbers only grew. Winter made it crueler. The sick grew cold as they grew weak, unable to warm themselves even with fires, their bodies collapsing inward until the final rattle left their lips. For the doctor, each door he knocked upon carried dread. Behind one, a mother cradled her child, begging for help he could not give. Behind another, an old man gasped, each breath a struggle against phlegm filling his lungs. Sometimes whole families lay in one room, the sick sharing space with the dying with the dead. He could not save them, but he could not turn away. His presence was ritual, a candle burning in darkness, though the flame gave no heat. The poor knew this truth, but called him anyway. They needed hope, or at least the semblance of it. His bag of powders, his muttered Latin, his cold hands on hot skin, all of it felt like action, like resistance against the inevitability clawing at them. Without him, there was only silence, and silence in winter meant surrender. The doctor himself was not immune. He carried disease with him. From bed to bed, patient to patient, he washed little. Disinfectants barely existed. Gloves were rare. His own cough deepened. His own hands trembled. Some doctors collapsed mid-rounds, claimed by the very illnesses they tried to confront. Their names were noted in obituaries, their practices absorbed by others, their deaths becoming one more tally in a city already drowning in them. There were few victories, a child's fever breaking, a cough fading after weeks, a man rising from bed to stagger into the street once more. These were celebrated, even if they were exceptions. Families wept in gratitude, thrusting coins into the doctor's hand, though he knew the cure was often nothing more than luck, the body's own strength against the cold. He took the money anyway, for he needed to eat, to buy coal, to keep walking the streets when others stayed inside. Survival demanded it, even for those who tried to save others. In wealthier districts, medicine offered more comfort, but little more success. Doctors arrived in polished carriages, their bags heavier, their fees steeper. They prescribed broths, fresh linens, heated bricks wrapped in cloth. They attended births, their hands guiding infants into a world already hostile. Yet even in these homes, death was common. Infants froze in their cradles. Mothers bled after childbirth. Old men succumbed to coughs that would not cease. Rich curtains could not block out the fog, nor coin purchase immunity from the air and water. The doctor's visit ended in silence here, as often as in the slums. Winter magnified everything. Illnesses that might have passed in summer lingered, worsened, grew fatal. Wounds healed slower, lungs fought harder, bodies weakened faster. Hunger sharpened every edge, making even minor sickness deadly. The doctor could not heal hunger, nor could he warm a house where coal was gone. He prescribed, he soothed, he stayed until hope flickered out, and then he left, his boots crunching over frost toward the next door that waited for him like a sentence. In time, the doctor himself became a symbol of the futility of London's winters. He was summoned because he had to be summoned, because it was unthinkable not to call him. But everyone knew, families, patients, even he himself, that his arrival meant little against the weight of the season. He was a figure in black against the snow, carrying powders that did not cure, leeches that did not save, and a knowledge that healing in this city was not yet possible. The truth was simple and cruel. In a Victorian winter, medicine could not save you. The city was stronger than the doctor, its poisons deeper than his tools, its cold sharper than his opiates. His presence brought comfort, but not survival. And so the carriages kept rolling, the bells kept tolling, and the city devoured its own, No matter how many doors the doctor knocked upon, no matter how many powders he poured, no matter how many prayers were whispered into the frozen night. When the lamps guttered low and frost crept thick along the glass, families turned to the one thing that stood between them and the suffocating night: fire. The flame was never constant, never secure. It was a trembling shield against the dark, one fed only as long as coal or wood could be scrounged. For most, the hearth burned low, embers red but fragile, struggling against the vast cold, pressing through every gap in the walls. To live through the winter was to live by the rhythm of fire, feeding it, guarding it, fearing it. London at night glowed not with safety, but with the restless hunger of flame. Chimneys belched smoke into skies already heavy with soot. Entire districts seemed stitched together by the dull orange flicker of windows, each home clutching its little blaze, as though it were a beating heart. But where there was fire, there was always danger. The city's houses were built close, walls leaning toward one another like conspirators. Roof lines nearly touched across alleys, wooden beams dry despite the damp, ready to catch if a single ember escaped. Curtains fluttered too near candles, coals rolled from grates, chimneys clogged and spat sparks onto straw roofs. At any hour, the sudden cry of fire could shatter the stillness, and flames would leap like beasts freed from chains, devouring timbers, crawling across rooftops, swallowing entire streets before water could be brought. Water itself was treacherous. In winter, pumps froze solid, buckets cracked in the cold, and men staggered with sloshing pails only to find hydrants useless. Fire brigades arrived with horse-drawn engines, their brass gleaming even in moonlight, but their efforts were hampered by ice-slick roads and brittle hoses. Sometimes they were too late before they had even started. The blaze had already taken what it desired, leaving behind nothing but blackened shells and drifting smoke. Survivors often had little more than the clothes on their backs. Families poured into the streets barefoot, clutching infants, watching everything they owned smolder to ash. For them, fire was not salvation, but thief. The cold they had feared would kill them still came, now sharper because it found them stripped of blankets, stripped of shelter, stripped of the fragile flame they had depended upon. Inside, the fire gave as much pain as it did comfort. Smoke clung thick in rooms where chimneys failed to draw properly. Black dust coated mantles, settled on lungs, left throats raw and eyes burning. Children coughed in their sleep, their breaths shallow and ragged. Women blackened by soot leaned wearily against the hearth after long days of tending both the flame and the endless laundry it created. Smoke never truly left. It hid in hair, in clothes, in skin, until it seemed one's very body exhaled it. Those too poor to afford coal scavenged what they could. Wood splinters from fences, discarded crates, even dried dung pressed into patties. Anything that might burn was gathered in sacks and dragged home. The poorest huddled around candles or oil lamps, their flames too small to warm, but bright enough to cast long, wavering shadows on walls. Entire families sometimes relied on a single wick, watching the wax pool and diminish, dreading the moment it guttered out. To be left in darkness was to surrender to the cold, and the cold had no mercy. There was another fire, one less controlled, one hidden in bottles and mugs. Gin burned throats, brandy numbed hunger, whiskey stoked an illusion of warmth. Taverns filled with men and women desperate to keep the frost at bay, their breaths clouding the air as much as the smoke of cheap pipes. The fire in their bellies promised reprieve, but it lied. It widened blood vessels, tricked the body into believing it was warm while hastening its collapse. Many staggered into alleys after drink, lay down in snow believing themselves safe, and were found frozen by morning, faces twisted in drunken sleep that never ended. The nights of London were never still. Alongside the whispers of fire and the cough of smoke came the ever-present watch for disaster. Families lay awake, ears straining for the crackle of burning timber, the sudden shouts outside. Mothers pressed hands to the chests of their children, feeling the rattling breath, wondering if the smoke from their own hearth would choke them before dawn. Fathers paced, calculating how many lumps of coal remained, whether the flame could be kept alive another night. And for all this vigilance, accidents were mercilessly common. Lamps overturned, setting nightgowns aflame. Sparks leapt onto straw mattresses. Children, curious or clumsy, reached too close to the fire, their cries piercing the silence as cloth ignited. Burns were often worse than frostbite. Skin blistered, peeled, left raw, infections spreading in wounds doctors could not heal. Survivors bore scars that marked them for life, twisted reminders of the night when the only source of warmth became the instrument of agony. Yet to go without flame was not an option. Darkness alone was unbearable. Winter lengthened the nights until they seemed eternal, hours of blackness pressing on every street. Without light, the city turned into a void where footsteps echoed too long and shadows seemed to move on their own. Fire was the only guard against the sense that something vast and hostile waited just beyond the door. It was prayer, weapon, and hope, all in one. The wealthy fed their hearths with imported coal, their dining halls bathed in light, chandeliers glittering with hundreds of candles. They too, however, lived with the threat of fire. Silk drapes, fine furniture, grand staircases. Everything burned as quickly as wood and straw when flames took hold. The richer the house, the more fuel it offered to the blaze. Servants stood ready with buckets, and yet no amount of wealth could erase the terror of waking to smoke curling through corridors, flames licking the carved banisters, the air itself turning lethal. Londoners lived as much by fire as by breath. Each night was a negotiation, enough flame to keep death from frost at bay, but not so much that it invited destruction. Enough smoke tolerated to warm the hearth, but not so much that it strangled. Each morning was a small victory, proof that the balance had been held for another day. Yet everyone knew balance could be lost in an instant. What made fire so cruel was its indifference. It promised life, but gave it only provisionally. It could warm the shivering or reduce them to ash. It lit rooms but blinded with smoke. It united families by the hearth but scattered them screaming into the streets. Its power was not in kindness but in demand. Feed me, guard me, respect me, and perhaps I will let you live. In London's winters, even nights were battles. The frost clawed from without, the fire demanded from within, and smoke filled the lungs that had already grown weary of the city's choking air. There was no true safety, no lasting reprieve. To close your eyes was to trust too much in a flame that might gutter, a chimney that might collapse, a coal that might leap onto the floorboards. The poor knew this truth most bitterly, but no one in London was free from it. Thus the city endured its nights not in rest, but in vigilance, in coughing, in the constant tending of fragile flames. Sleep came uneasily, if at all, for who could surrender fully to dreams when fire and smoke were as much enemies as the frost outside? Each dawn found London still standing, but scarred, blackened, weary, proof only that it had survived another of its endless battles against the very elements it relied upon. Nights in Victorian London belonged neither to the living nor the dead, but to fire and smoke, which claimed both with equal appetite. And in such nights, survival was never assured, only borrowed, only begged, only stolen for a little longer from forces that demanded repayment in ash. In the streets where fog and frost mingled until neither could be separated, the smallest figures suffered most. Children were everywhere in Victorian London, darting between carts, huddled in doorways, clutching rags against their thin shoulders. They were born into the season's cruelty, inheriting hunger before they could speak, labour before they could walk, and sickness before they could dream. For them, winter was not a passing hardship, but a constant adversary. The city swallowed childhood whole, and the cold was its sharpest weapon. Infants lay in cradles too close to draughty walls, their breaths shallow, their tiny fingers blue before the first light of morning. Mothers wrapped them in shawls, pressed them against their own chests, trying to lend warmth from bodies already depleted. Many did not wake, their silence greeted with resignation rather than surprise. Infant mortality was so common it was measured not by grief, but by statistics. numbers scrawled in ledgers that grew thicker with every winter. Those who survived infancy were soon thrust into the streets. Small hands learned quickly to grasp at opportunity. Scraps of food, bits of coal fallen from carts, paper to sell, mudlark treasures dredged from the Thames. The river's edge teemed with children, their bare feet cracked and bleeding in the ice, their hands raw from pulling cold metal or bone from the sludge. They laughed sometimes, not from joy, but from the delirium of survival, a laugh that vanished when frost stiffened their lips. Marketplaces, already harsh with frostbitten crowds, became the proving grounds for young lungs and thin arms. Boys tugged at the sleeves of passers-by, offering matches or boot-blacking. Girls carried baskets too large for their frames, selling wilted vegetables or scraps of fish. Every word they spoke turned to steam in the air, their voices hoarse, their coughs constant. Coins were rare, slaps more common. They returned home, or to whatever corner passed for home, with little more than exhaustion etched deep into their young faces. Factories and workshops devoured children as readily as the streets did. Winter made labor even more brutal. Fingers stiffened by cold were still expected to tie threads, polish metal, turn wheels. If they faltered, overseers' canes cracked against their backs. Chimney sweeps climbed flues still warm from fires, scraping soot with lungs that had never known clean air. In winter, the chimneys burned constantly, and the boys inside them worked until they coughed blood into their hands. They returned to the alleys with faces blackened, eyes red, their bodies trembling from cold and exhaustion. Disease clung to children with a tenacity that mocked hope. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, all spread quickly in cramped, cold rooms where entire families huddled for warmth. A child's cough could echo through a whole street, pass from one doorway to the next, until the sound was as common as footsteps on cobblestones. Doctors prescribed rest and nourishment, but rest was impossible on straw pallets shared by six, and nourishment was a luxury most had never known. The smallest and weakest withered, leaving parents to cradle bundles of stillness as frost gathered on the window panes. The workhouses swallowed children too, tearing them from their parents' arms the moment they entered. Boys were sent to labor, girls to laundries. Childhood was stripped away as systematically as names from a ledger. They learned discipline instead of play, routine instead of tenderness. Winter there was no gentler than in the streets. The blankets were thin, the food thin gruel, the air so cold that ice formed on water jugs beside their pallets. Nights echoed with coughing and quiet sobs, the sound of spirits breaking long before bodies followed. And yet, children survived, in ways both desperate and astonishing. They made games of scavenging, chasing after wagon wheels, pretending the frost was a kingdom and the snow their crown. Their laughter, brief, fleeting, was the only sound that seemed alive in streets otherwise choked by fog and death. But even play was edged with danger. Snowball fights ended with frostbitten fingers. Ice skating on the frozen Thames ended with drownings beneath brittle surfaces. The city seemed to wait patiently for its chance to claim them, whether in laughter or in labor. There were stories, whispered by those who watched the smallest ones struggle, of angel children who froze in doorways, their faces peaceful, their rags wrapped around them like shrouds. Passers-by walked past, heads bowed, until someone finally gathered the body and carried it to a pauper's grave. These deaths became part of the city's rhythm, accepted as winter's tithe. Newspapers sometimes recorded them, but only briefly, tucked between advertisements and trade reports, as though a child's life weighed less than the price of coal. The wealthy watched these children from carriages, their own wrapped in furs, cheeks flushed from heated parlours. To them, the poor child on the corner was not a reflection, but a warning, a living reminder of what lay below the fragile line of fortune. Some tossed pennies, others turned away, but none could erase the sight. Hollow eyes, lips trembling, limbs too thin for the weight they carried. The city's wealth did not hide the truth. It only cast it into sharper contrast. For the children of London, winter carved scars that lasted far beyond the season. Those who survived grew into adults already bent. their bodies weakened by years of hunger and exposure. Their lungs carried the frost's memory, their bones set, crooked from labour, their skin pocked with the marks of disease. Childhood for them was never a time of growth, but a long apprenticeship in suffering. The endless cold did not just take lives, it reshaped the very idea of what a child was. In wealthier circles, childhood was a protected stage, filled with toys, tutors, and warmth. For the majority, it was an unending test of endurance, a season that began at birth and ended only in death. The city had no patience for innocence. It demanded labour, it demanded silence, it demanded survival against odds stacked too steeply for the smallest shoulders to bear. When dawn came and the fog lifted slightly, one could see them most clearly. Children with cracked lips selling matches, children with frostbitten ears running errands, children with bundles of newspapers under arms too thin to hold them steady. Their faces were raw with wind, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, their breaths clouding like ghosts already half-formed. They were the living proof that in London's winters, survival was not measured by strength alone, but by a cruel lottery of chance. And chance was merciless. One child might stagger through another winter, his body gaunt but enduring. Another might collapse in the snow after a day's work, her limbs stiff before anyone noticed. Entire generations bore the mark of winters survived, but not defeated. Their memories of frost passed down like curses. The endless cold had no pity. It reached into cradles, into classrooms, into alleys, into workhouses, and it claimed what it wished. And so the children of London's winters became not just victims, but emblems, symbols of a city where even the smallest, most fragile lives were expected to endure what no one should have to face. For them, survival was never guaranteed, never gentle. It was stolen in moments. An ember found, a crust shared, a night endured without freezing. But the cold always waited, endless and patient, claiming childhood itself as its most faithful possession. The frost did not care for names, nor did it respect the dignity of age. But in London, it was the poor who found themselves its chosen prey. For them, the season was not a passing inconvenience, but an executioner whose hand reached into every alley, every cellar, every room where hunger was already a tenant. Poverty in the winter months did not mean discomfort, it meant death, waiting in corners, ready to claim the next shivering body that faltered. The poor were not scattered. They were pressed together in neighbourhoods where the air seemed thicker with smoke and despair, where the narrow lanes admitted little light and no warmth. Rooms were carved from cellars, attics, or spaces too mean to be thought of as homes. Families of 6 or more crowded into chambers meant for one, their breaths condensing on walls already slick with damp. In summer, these rooms stank of rot. In winter, they turned into tombs, without coal or blankets, without food enough to sustain heat in their bodies. The poor slept in clumps like animals, shivering themselves into exhaustion. Many simply never woke. The streets bore witness to the failure of flesh against frost. In the mornings, figures were sometimes found slumped in doorways or sprawled beneath bridges, beggars who had huddled through the night and lost their wager against the cold. Constables carried them away, not with ceremony, but with routine, their bodies carted to paupers' graves before the city resumed its indifference. Death among the poor was no tragedy for London at large. It was an expected season's toll, a statistic recorded with the same detachment as the price of flour. Funerals for the destitute were stripped of everything but necessity. Coffins, if provided, were little more than planks hammered together, reused when wood was scarce. Pauper graves lay in the outskirts, pits dug deep enough to swallow dozens, the dead stacked one upon another in soil too frozen to yield easily. There were no names carved, no hymns sung, only the thud of earth on wood, repeated until the pit was filled. In some parishes, bodies lingered above ground for days, while gravediggers battled frozen earth. their silence another reminder of how winter extended even into the grave. Survival, for those who remained, was an act of barter with the elements. Scarcity turned food into treasure. Bread was stretched thin, broth watered until it resembled nothing but warmth. Children chewed on crusts hardened like stone, their bellies bloated not from plenty but from air. Meat was a fantasy, coal an unreachable luxury. Families scavenged for sticks, scraps, anything that would burn. The poor sold what little they had, clothes, tools, even the blankets that once shielded them from frost, until there was nothing left but themselves. Some sold labour, others their very bodies, all to buy a single meal or a handful of fuel. Even charity froze in winter. The wealthy sometimes donated blankets or food, but the scale of need dwarfed generosity. Soup kitchens overflowed with the desperate, bowls rationed to thin lines of men and women whose faces were already hollowed by hunger. Workhouses took in more souls than they could bear, cramming them into wards where disease bred faster than comfort. The season that buried the poor did not always kill with frost alone. It killed with hunger, with filth, with contagion carried on the coughs of those too weak to cover their mouths. The poorhouses, built as a solution, became chambers of despair in their own right. Their rules were harshest in winter, when more sought entry. Families were separated, men and women divided, children pulled from parents' arms. To accept shelter meant to accept punishment, hours of grinding labour, meagre rations, thin blankets. Many chose the streets instead, gambling on survival rather than submitting to indignity. The cold did not forgive either choice, and yet poverty was not only measured in empty pockets, it was visible in bodies, stooped backs, missing teeth, twisted limbs. Winter accentuated every weakness. The poor who were sick grew sicker, their coughs turning to rattles in their chests. The old lost what little strength they had, their hands trembling too violently to hold the scraps of food they earned. Infants, born into rooms with no heat, perished before their eyes ever saw daylight. Poverty was a lineage, inherited and passed down like disease, and winter was the season that thinned the bloodline. There were moments when the city seemed to acknowledge its forgotten dead. Newspaper reports described the poor frozen in the night, though always briefly, always as curiosities rather than indictments. Philanthropists organized dinners where a few hundred might be fed, their bellies filled for a day before returning to hunger. But the city as a whole marched on. Carriages rolled past the shivering masses. Gas lamps illuminated shop fronts where luxuries glittered, and theatres roared with laughter. The poor were buried not only in graves, but beneath layers of indifference, their suffering hidden in plain sight. The Thames, choked with ice, reflected this duality. Along its banks, the destitute scavenged for coal dropped from barges, while just upriver, the affluent strolled embankments wrapped in fur. Winter split the city cleanly, those who endured it with discomfort and those whom it buried. Poverty made the difference between returning to a warm hearth or to a straw pallet soaked in damp, between sipping hot tea or chewing on crusts, between surviving until spring or being carried away on a death cart at dawn. In the alleys, rumours spread of the angels of winter, children whose frozen bodies were found in doorways, their stillness mistaken at first for sleep. The stories travelled because they struck a chord, even among the hardened. But such pity never translated into prevention. Each winter brought more angels, more nameless paupers, more funerals without mourners. The city buried its poor with regularity, each grave another stone laid in the foundation of indifference. Even the churches could not soften the season's cruelty. They held services, prayed for warmth, but their pews filled with parishioners too weak to stand, too cold to concentrate. Some churches opened their doors at night, allowing the poor to huddle on stone floors until dawn, their breaths rising like incense to the rafters. But these were gestures, not solutions. God's house was warmer than the street, but not enough to stave off frostbite. not enough to silence hunger. The poor endured, as they always had, but endurance was not the same as survival. For everyone who staggered through winter's gauntlet, another fell. The streets became graveyards without headstones, filled with faces remembered only by those who passed them. Winter's tally was not written in history books, but in the empty spaces left at crowded tables, in the rags that went unworn because the bodies that once wore them were gone. The season that buried the poor did more than claim lives. It carved divisions deeper, reminding all who look that wealth was the only true insulation against death. The poor could not buy warmth, could not buy food, could not buy a reprieve. They could only offer themselves, their labour, their dignity, and in the end, their lives. And London, vast and indifferent, accepted the offering as if it were due. When the frost finally loosened its grip and spring's thaw crept across the cobblestones, the poor who had survived emerged like shadows, thinner, weaker, but still breathing. They carried with them the memory of those buried by the cold, the friends and family who had not endured. And yet they knew another winter would come, another season waiting to strip away what little they had left. Poverty, like winter, was never truly defeated. It only waited for its turn again. And so, each year, the poor were buried twice, once in frozen soil, and once in the memory of a city that forgot them almost as soon as the earth closed. And so, the story draws its breath to a close. Tonight we have wandered together through a London winter that did not forgive weakness, where fog suffocated, hunger hollowed, and shadows carried more than silence. We have stood at doorways where the poor froze in place, walked among workhouses that broke the body before the cold ever could, and looked into the faces of children whose winters never ended. The lesson is not that the past was cruel. It is that survival was never guaranteed. The Victorian winter was not simply a season. It was a predator, waiting in every alley, pressing against every window, seeping into every lung. It buried the poor, it tested the rich, and it reminded every Londoner that life itself was as fragile as the flame of a single candle flickering in the fog. Now I want to hear from you. Which moment stayed with you most tonight? Was it the choking air of the fog, the gnawing hunger behind shuttered windows, or the death carts rattling over cobblestones in the dark? Tell me in the comments, because your perspective adds another voice to this conversation across time. And before you leave, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Not only does it help keep this channel alive, but it also ensures these forgotten histories, these haunting reminders of where we've come from, continue to reach others, maybe even someone in your own family. So share your location, your time, your thoughts, and know that as you do, you become one of those glowing lights on our map of the world, connected through stories, even in the darkest winters of history. Until next time, stay curious, stay restless, and remember, survival has always been a fragile thing.